Hello, welcome to the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show. I'm your host, Chris A. Matthews, and once again, I have another phenomenal guest. I would like to introduce you all to Joelle Maletis. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good, Chris. Thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here.
Man, so glad you're here. And those that have listened to our show in the past, you got it right. Yes, she is a licensed marriage and family therapist, among other things as well. I want you to tell our audience what got you into counseling. That's always the question I love to start with because I do believe that this work is a calling. So, how were you called into this field to be a mental health professional?
Oh, I love this question, especially the way that you put it, a calling, because I'll be honest with you, I felt like it was a dart on a dartboard. I didn't study psychology. I had a master's in education and a master's in fine arts dance. I was a ballerina by training and had a 22-year professional dance career and career-ending injuries. And one would think I would have gone to therapy during this time, but I did not. And then when I finally, my world was spiraling out of control and crashing around, I had a great therapist. I finally went to therapy, and I just remember thinking, I don't ever want anybody to feel as bad as I feel right now.
Mm.
And that compared to having, a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I went, all right, well, what can I do where I can be full-time mom, and then have a flexible schedule. And psychology sounded great. That's the honest story. I think really it came down to I was starting to uncover my own very complex trauma. Was diagnosed with PTSD, and I finally felt like I had a little bit of control in therapy, and there was something magical for me about that. And I think that's really what brought me to study therapy. But I was joking with you earlier, and I said, I tell my clinicians all the time, and I do not mean to be disrespectful. I say this with love. Only crazy people go to psych school, because
Absolutely.
how much psychology do you want to do? You're studying it, you're breathing it, you're living it, you're in your own therapy, you're doing therapy. It's just it's a little on the crazy side or obsessive side. And I didn't think I would love it. And what I found is that I absolutely loved it as much as I love dancing, and that was the blessing with
And
it.
and I appreciate you describing that you were led into the field based on your own process. You did your own work. There was also a trauma. When you think about a career-ending injury, you were a dancer. That was an identity. And
Yeah.
now it was like a shift. I almost think about how you have a professional that might be dissolving a sports career or even a military professional that's transitioning back to civilian life. Can you talk about a little bit more on how your personal journey led to you specializing as one of the nation's leading top trauma professionals?
Yeah. It's not really what I went into school to study. I think it's what led me to school. And I was sharing with you earlier too, like the first year of grad school, I did a 3-year master's program and then a clinical PhD program. But my first year in grad school, my master's program, I think I was in the fetal position the entire year. I was so anxious and spun all the time. I didn't think I was going to make it through. And some of it was that identity. I wake up every day, and there are times where I forget that I'm not a dancer. I'd been doing it since I was 3. And so there was this loss, and I was grieving that. I felt my body betrayed me.
Mm.
And so I was going through it without having words to describe all of that. Um, and so it was this thing that I was going through, and starting to, from an academic perspective, right, understand bits and pieces of it. When I started doing the work, my dissertation was in eating disorders, addictions, and trauma. I'm a ballerina. We can draw the dots. Not hard to figure out, right? And my clinical supervisor at the time said, "You can't do that work." And I went, "What do you mean I can't do that work?" And they said, "You won't, you're not going to recover. You're not going to heal if you do that work." And they weren't wrong. So I threw myself into working in eating disorders and addictions and all of that. And
So when they said that you wouldn't heal, were they implying that you hadn't done enough of your own work to be able to go deeper into learning and processing and teaching other people?
Yeah, yeah, that I was still so far in my own trauma,
Mhm.
right? That it wasn't necessarily the right population for me. And even to this day, what I find is I work with I do have some career dancers and professional athletes, and I can have a few of those clients on my docket at a time, but I can't do 40 hours a week
Right.
with it because
How
it
did
is
they know that?
right.
Yeah, right. It would trigger you, but how did your clinical supervisor, how did these professionals that were in your space on your team, how did they help you identify that? Because I'm hearing you say that they're telling you what you couldn't do in that moment,
Yeah.
but it sounds like it would have been the perfect marriage because you can relate to what those individuals are experiencing who've lost a career, and we know loss is a type of trauma. So
Right.
tell us more on what they might have seen or identified to say that to you.
Yeah, I think some of it is just when I was trained as a therapist. This was, early 2000s, and that was the school of thought. You can't work in what we call transference or counter transference when it's about
Mhm.
you, right? So my own issues become the center of the client's experience, which is what we don't want to do in therapy. And so I think what they were concerned about was my ability to hold that space. I think it was a fair concern. Good clinical supervisors, tell us what we don't want to hear.
Right. Yeah.
And it kept me going to therapy. And part of it was I was a career dancer. I had a roller coaster ride. I'm used to being told no, I can't do things. And so that was just game on. All
I,
right, fine. Yeah, you think I can't do this? Watch me. And like I said, in some ways they weren't wrong. It was a population that working with eating disorders and trauma for 40 hours a week, right? Every week constantly was too much, but doing that work with other populations was the perfect, as you would say, marriage, right? And so some of it was that's where I started as a trainee. As
Mhm.
an intern, I went and worked in a hospital. So I went and took a completely different approach, started working with PTSD and trauma, um, and fell in love with it. And that's a weird thing to say. And I think
So
part of it,
talk about that love. Like what led you to fall in love with this population?
yeah, I think in a weird way, I felt it gave me a lot of validation. And what I mean by that is I could sit with somebody and listen to really horrific stories and narratives about what people are and couples were experiencing.
Mhm.
Um, and there was part of it where it was like, I I totally get how this feels, mind, body, spirit, like all of me. I get how this feels. And um I remember what I felt like. Remember, I started saying I didn't want anybody to ever feel the way I felt.
Wow.
So
So the empathy.
yeah, and so it was like I understand what this feels like for me. I don't necessarily know what they're going through. I'm not them, right? But I understand what this felt like for me and how powerful the work with my therapist was. And so if I could just sit and be present with the horrific stories or narratives, right, that they were reliving, and I could help give them some skills, right, that
Yeah.
that made me feel useful, and for a long time I didn't feel useful.
Mm. And so there are a couple of things I'm hearing I want to process because this visual of being able to see a spirit, right? To actually see hurt and make it tangible. If spirits were the light inside the person, you were able to see that spirit or that light outside of that person because that was the same spirit or light that you might have encountered. So although you didn't want other people to feel that, you could acknowledge and identify when they had felt it.
Yeah.
And then there was a relatability because we talked earlier about how we hear it as students in this craft in this field that the alliance or the connection or the ability to create that relationship with the therapist and with the client, that's what is the major agent of change. Yeah. And your level to empathize went so much deeper, it sounds like. But through that, I'm curious, through learning and hearing about other people's pain, aligning with the understanding that what that felt like, was that also part of your journey of healing too at the same time?
Sure. I remember, one of my very first clinical supervisors said to me, Joe, the universe only gives you what you need. And I went, what do you mean by that? She said, it means that all of your clients that you get will be mirrors of what you need to work on. And I went, well, that doesn't sound great.
I got chills hearing that, because as a practicing clinician as well, I can completely see that. And when you think about the population our show targets, couples who are in those tough seasons of marriages,
right?
Talk about how partners can first identify if their spouse or partner may be experiencing adverse side effects of unprocessed trauma. And if they identify that, like what are some cues? Like, give our listeners cues to acknowledge, like, oh, my partner may be experiencing unprocessed trauma, because in a relationship, the first thing we think the problem is us.
Yeah, totally.
Even if it's not, we think it's us.
I must have done something.
Right. What did I do? And it may not have anything to do with us.
Yeah, and I think that comes from that we pick up as partners, and even us as therapists. I mean, I'll admit my life is nowhere near perfect. My relationship is nowhere near perfect. I fall into the same traps that, other people do. And I teach this stuff for a living, right?
Absolutely.
So, right. Like it's a process, not perfection. And so, I think part of it starts with how we define trauma. So for me personally, and professionally, I always say trauma is in the eyes of the beholder. We used to define it by big T. It was something that I experienced directly, sexual assault, right? Domestic violence, severe car accident, something that happened to my person that put me in a place of horror and potential demise, right? And little T trauma was something that I witnessed or observed. I watched somebody, mugged on the street, right? Or I watched a fight, something that I was viewing. We as clinicians have really moved away from this idea of big T, little T trauma, because we leave out so many other issues. Yeah. And in intergenerational trauma, when we look at it from big T, little T, we look at it from a privileged socioeconomic perspective, which trauma is not. Trauma is not picky. Everybody gets to have it. So I think some of it starts with moving away from putting trauma in a box. Well, it has to be something that's really big, because that's not always the case. So if it's traumatic to a client, then it's trauma. It doesn't have to be traumatic to me. Gotcha. Right. And so that's the first piece. And I think what happens with partners is that we don't see trauma that way. And then we trigger, the crap out of each other, right? Because I don't know what the trauma triggers are for my partner. I don't know everything that they have experienced. Right. So much of it can be early childhood. It can be subconscious. It can be pre-verbal, where we don't have words for it. Right.
Talk about that subconscious. Go back to that for a second, because I think about how you said something that was very important. We can trigger our partner's trauma, and now you have two people that are adverse or going in opposite directions, and the person that might have started out was just trying to help. Right. And so talk about like the subconscious trauma that could be potentially triggered by a partner that may be attempting to help.
Yeah, really, really, I think easy example to understand is if somebody grew up in a family where they were yellers.
Okay.
That's what they know. And if you were to say, was your childhood traumatic? Chances are, if there was no other thing other than yelling, right, they'd say no. But anytime I yell and my partner has this, cowering, or they kind of shrink, right? They shrink inside, or they have an equally explosive reaction. So they yell back. Clearly, I've triggered them by yelling. But if I were to say, did you, was your childhood traumatic? They'd say no. Right.
Wow.
So,
That was a great example.
yeah.
That was a
Right.
great example. And a lot of times with couples, we see that because one partner, especially depending on culture, may speak with a level of passion.
Yeah.
It's, I'm not yelling, I'm just very expressive in my language. Well, the other partner may not be able to disassociate that as passion. They see it as, well, my parents, they weren't passionate, they were yelling.
They were yelling, or they yelled at me when I was in trouble. And so yes, this, one person who is very animated and loud and, like you said, passionate, they have a lot of velocity and energy, right? The other person, can feel attacked. Like that starts to trigger their fight, flight, freeze mechanism, right? And so they're moving into protection mode. Now I'm defending myself, right? Whether I realize it or not, either I'm shrinking, I'm walking out of the room, right? So, my partner gets excited, they start yelling, they talk with their hands, right? And I go, oh, I'm out. I can't deal with this. And
We have this distancer and pursuer.
yeah. And
Goes
so
away, one pursues. And
right. And so then, they come into therapy and you say, was your childhood traumatic? No. And it takes a while to uncover, okay, what is this pattern of behavior, right? Well, he yells at me and I leave, or she yells at me and I leave. I don't want to be gender specific, just right, for the sake of examples. And you're like, that's interesting. So anytime she yells at you, you walk out of the room. Yeah. Why? I don't know. I don't like to be yelled at. Why? Where does that come from? Why is that? And the person that's yelling is saying, but I'm not yelling. I'm not angry with you. I'm not yelling at you. The thing pissed me off. And like, I don't understand. Every time I try and express how I feel, you leave, you abandon me. Oh, there's some interesting subconscious trauma, right? It's all in what people say.
And as I'm hearing you speak, I think about like this approach of like extracting the problem from the person, where the yelling is the problem, is not the person, but the yelling comes from their family of origin. And then we continue to dive deeper and unravel these layers where we may not have even known that was a trauma, but now it's being exposed later on in this current relationship. But when asked during the assessment, any childhood trauma? No. So how we define trauma is the starting point. Now, when you find a couple, or let's say a partner listening is hearing what we're saying, and they're like, yes, that's exactly what I'm going through with my partner.
Yeah.
What are the steps? Because as you and I both know, couples can be in distress for several years before they attempt counseling. Right. And when we say you need counseling, then the person hears that as I'm the problem. So what language can these can our listeners use, the individuals that are in these tough seasons to help get to a point of resolve?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and so bear with me here, and I'll do my best to answer that on a few different levels. So I'll tell you the thing not to do. The thing not to do is, you know what, Chris, I think you've got a lot of trauma.
Okay, note to everybody: don't try to diagnose your spouse. It's not your job to diagnose your spouse and tell them they have a lot of trauma or tell them what their problems or issues are. Right. So stay off of Google, stay off of all of the psychology websites that attempt to tell you what you are. Don't do that to your partner.
Do not do that. There are some great books. Still my favorite, again, I think it's the gold standard, is Vander Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. And I'll give it to you so you can put in your show notes, where people can listen to some audiobooks about trauma and how we hold trauma, how we process trauma. But I would look at trusted resources if you're going to go on the internet and Google, like stay off of, anyway, it doesn't matter, but don't go down the rabbit hole of Google trying to diagnose your partner. When you have conversations with your partner, I statements coming from a place of, this is my experience, right? As opposed to you statements. And here, to be very gender specific, and here's the disclaimer, I'm not trying to offend anyone here, but I want to just give an example. With men, when we say, doesn't matter how nicely we say it, can you please take out the garbage? They'll be like, yeah. Does the garbage get taken out? No. Honey, will you please take out the garbage? No, doesn't get taken out. Okay, now I'm mad. Can you just take out the goddamn, take out the garbage?
Right.
Because when we tell men, can you do this? The response is, of course I can.
I can do anything. I'm a man. Yeah,
I'm a man. I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
I'm not doing it right. Because what we're really poking at is ability. Are you able? When we say the word can, try this at home. Even try it if you have a son. Try it at home, right? When we say, would you please take out the garbage? The response is, oh, of course I can. I'll do it after the game. Because we're not questioning somebody's ability to do it. We're asking for a favor, right? So with women, anytime you say you, and you will get, and if you try this at home, I don't recommend it. When you say to a woman, you will instantly get arms crossed, across the chest, right? Cocked head, pursed lips, me what? And you could be saying, you are the most beautiful woman in the entire world. The minute we hear you, we're like, what? What are you going to tell me about me? All right, let's instant defense, right? Because women are constantly defending, our being, who we are, how we are, what we look like, right? Women are constantly undervalued. So when we hear the word you, we are automatically in defensive.
Attack immediately.
Yeah, we feel attacked immediately. Gotcha. And so, and again, I'm just broad brush with the genders just to make the illustration.
This is good stuff though, right? Because when I hear that women may be triggered by the you statement, it's also playing into this societal theme that women have to be these super creatures, and it's like another jab or poke. I've even heard my wife acknowledge, like, we were on the way to my son's school for teacher parent conference, and if the reading is a little bit below the baseline, or if there's something not right, that weight, that identity, that the mom wasn't doing a good job, or when the theme when you go into a person's home, the wife or the woman of the house is responsible for how the home looks, and it sounds like using you is just another tack, another add-on to all that additional pressure that women are already having to deal with as well. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, and men typically don't respond to the word you. If I say, hey, you did this thing, there's a different reaction to that. It's either, yeah, I did, or no, I didn't, right? But there's not this instant defense around the word you. Because like I said, it could be the most lovely thing that someone would want to say to their spouse, right? You're so beautiful to me, but that you is going to shut down the conversation. So when we talk about trauma and talking about trauma with our partners, coming from an heartfelt statement, I feel like I said something that really hurt, that hurt you. And I think that's a safe way to say you, because I'm starting with me. I think I did something, and I'm not sure what I did. And I would really like to know, so I don't do that again. Right? There's that ownership, authenticity, validation. Honey,
you gave a formula. You said ownership, authenticity, validation. I just want to make sure people are listening. So ownership, authenticity, and then validation.
Yeah.
That's really your 3-step process: ownership, authenticity, validation. Yeah. And then you package that with I, because when you say I, that's the ownership. When you say I, that's me being authentic. I have to be vulnerable enough to acknowledge what I might not have done right. And then the validation I'm hearing is the point. Like, I don't want to do that again. I want to protect our relationship by not continuing to do things that hurt. Yeah. So I'm open to wanting to learn, but I need my partner's help in order to be educated on what I'm doing that may be causing pain.
Exactly. You know, my feelings are really hurt. I feel dismissed. I feel devalued. I'm angry, right? That's a very different message than you hurt my feelings,
Absolutely. Yeah,
right?
you're keeping the problem away from the person. At that point, we're not keeping score on you're bad or I'm good or you're good, I'm bad. It's more about what the experience. So you're highlighting the experience and not the person.
Exactly. So when we talk about trauma, you know, honey, I think I really triggered you. I can't, you know, every time I come around the corner, I startle you. And I'm not sure, like, I'm not sure what to do with that, right? Is there some, do you know why? Is there something that we should talk about, right? So notice how I'm saying, I'm owning, like, I recognize I did this thing and I'm really confused about it, as opposed to, wow, you startle easily. Do you have like trauma in your background? Like, what's your story?
And I think a lot of times, I'm speaking for myself, not all men, but I think from a male perspective, we want to be these protectors, we want to be these providers, we want to be these fixers. So when we're doing something that is adverse to that, our immediate go-to is like, all right, you know I want to fix it. So if something's wrong, then this might be on you because I'm the fixer. So how's the fixer being the one that's breaking something too?
Yeah. And I think too, you know, I love working with couples. And one of the these are like, if you were to come into my therapy session, you're going to learn this first session out the gate. We go over consent, and then I'm like, all right, let me teach you about I statements. Right? Very first session. We're going to work with, because before we can get into the deeper stuff, I believe that people need skills, right? We can't change defense mechanism patterns. We can't change trauma. We can't change interaction if we don't have new skills to be able to implement, right?
And I want to commend you as well, Joelle, because most people have at some point in their life maybe heard I statements, right? Maybe they haven't, but maybe they have. It's not that you're saying use I statements. You're giving clear details on how to use an I statement, the value of using an I statement, what the expected outcome should be from using an I statement. And I hope the listeners are out there, because most people that are a little concerned about going to counseling, they attempt to solve their problem, which we should prior to counseling. But if you find yourself in this ongoing cycle where you might be listening and saying, I have used I statements. Sure, it doesn't work. But maybe you're not using it in the confines of a third-party professional like Joelle that's able to help your partner hear why you're using the I statement. Right. So I think the therapy space provides a little more support so the person doesn't feel like, oh, you're just using a tactic on me. I want you to talk about how couples who both have experienced trauma can find a solace or a peace in coming together within their shared trauma space. And we've heard the term trauma bonding.
Yeah.
Is it bad? Is it good? Is it indifferent? Give us kind of the directory on if that's something that a couple should or shouldn't be, pros, cons. Like, let's talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So just rewinding just a bit for a second too, you know, skills help, but we don't get it 100% of the time. I will, full self-disclosure, you know, my spouse and I, we got into it a couple weeks ago, and I was really angry, and he kept saying, I'm just trying. And I was so mad. I'm like, I don't really care. Which was a horrible thing to say, right? And I teach this stuff for a living. Like, part of it is we have to give ourselves some grace. Don't wait to go to couples counseling. I'm going to say it again. Do not wait to go to couples counseling. When you go in the beginning stages of a problem and you've hit 2 or 3 months where you're grinding on a problem and you go to therapy, chances are it's short-term therapy. You can resolve the problem, learn great skills, and do some really deep work. And then you stop going to therapy until you have another problem that you're grinding on again, right? When you wait and you go to therapy 3, 4, 5 years into backed up marriage, then by the time you're coming into therapy, usually one person is pretty close to being done. And so couples don't want to go to therapy because they say, well, my friends went to therapy and their marriage ended. Well, yeah, because they probably waited too long. So we take marriage. So that was the other piece of the trauma part, right? Is when we say, hey, I think we need to go to therapy, we take that as an affront. Instead of saying, I would like to go to therapy to help us learn some new ways to handle this scenario when we get into an argument and you're really trying, like my poor spouse, you're really trying, and I don't care, right? That's devastating. I don't know how to recover from that.
Right. It was too late.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad you shared that, because couples need to hear that. They need to hear, when you go to counseling, it doesn't mean that you're going to end the relationship. You can go during a stage or a phase of the relationship to prevent needing more medication down the road, right? It's like, I know COVID-19, and the goal is not to evoke any trauma, because a lot of people lost people during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's like, I have actually a close friend. He was my chiropractor. He died. And by the time he got to the hospital, he had tried to self-medicate by way of all these different extraction machines, because he was a chiropractor, a wellness professional.
Yeah.
But by the time he got to the hospital, he died 2 days later. And the doctors said it. They were like, hey, if he would have got in at the early stages when he initially had a problem breathing, it would have been no question this guy would have lived. He was like 45 in perfect health. But he waited so long that the pneumonia and the infection had gotten to the point where the doctors didn't have any time to help him heal. So don't wait so long to go to counseling, so the therapist doesn't have enough time to help you heal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was going to say that just ties into like this idea of trauma bonding. So what is trauma bonding? It looks like there's two different ways that shows up. One is that I have trauma, you have trauma. We get together because we both have trauma and we get each other, right? And it a lot of times I'll hear couples say, they made me feel less broken, and broken underscore highlighted, in neon flashing lights, right? They made me feel less broken because they had something that happened to them too, right? So we get each other. So with trauma bonding, and sometimes it's not articulated that eloquently, or we don't even realize that that's what we have, right? We're in this cycle.
Well, just for clarity, I like to repeat things on this show, just make sure people hear it, but I'm hearing, they made me feel less broken.
Yeah.
That's a heavy statement.
Yeah.
And I just want that to sink in. They made me feel less broken.
Yeah.
Keep going. I had to pause.
Yeah. No, right. And when we have things like, first responders, ICU nurses during COVID, military, people that have food scarcity, impoverished, socioeconomic differences, intergenerational, the list goes on and on. A lot of times what happens is people have this moral injury. There's an injury to who they are, what they believe, what their value system is, right? So this idea of moral injury, there's a wound to my soul.
Wow. You put on a masterclass today. Moral injury, wound to my soul. Like, these are some really heavy statements.
Yeah.
They're allowing people to understand how heavy trauma can be.
Yeah. And that could be the child that grew up in a family where they had an unpredictable parent. They had parents that yelled and fought all the time, who maybe did not divorce, right? That they were exposed to, IPV.
Interpartner violence.
Right. Yeah. And that they don't think that their life was traumatic, because that's not how they're defining trauma. So we kind of go back to that, right? But there's this way that I've watched people engage in relationships that I'm replicating in my own life. And so when somebody else has trauma, and it's to kind of come full circle, right? One of the things that we started talking about was my own trauma, and that's what led me to wanting to work do therapy, and eventually what I was good at was working with trauma. You feel it when you sit with someone who has trauma. You instantly feel that energy, right? Their nervousness or anxiety doesn't escalate as you start to unfold your story or your narrative. When you're telling them what your traumas are, you don't feel that shaky energy, right? Or this anxiety. When people have trauma and they sit with somebody else who has trauma, it's comforting, right? Because they don't rattle.
This whole conversation is comforting because I'm experiencing, you talked about like as a therapist when we have countertransference, our experience, and I'm feeling now this reflection. I share my own story in my book about growing up in a household with a functional drug addict father. Best father in the world, but I mean, I would tell stories. One of the first stories I told my wife when we were dating, I played little league football, high school football, and I was always the last kid picked up in the parking lot. It was so bad. The coach was like, "Look, man, I can't wait on you. I gotta go home to my family." And I would be sitting under the one light pole in the parking lot, and this car comes speeding in, right? Everyone's already gone, and he's speeding in the parking lot. That's my dad, because he was going to get high after work before coming to pick me up. And that was the routine. And I didn't know at the time as a kid, but you could feel this tightness. You just knew something wasn't right. Or when you witness your parents never together, one's upstairs, one's downstairs. Our mommy and daddy never in the same room. Holidays. And this is the thing. I know we're recording around the holiday season now, but the show may air in the future. But anyone listening who is in this holiday season that we're about to enter or we're in now, that could be subconscious trigger for people because you remember what it was like to have that tension. And a lot of divorces are filed around this time of the year. A lot of people attend counseling after, hey, the final straw that broke the camel's back was the holiday season. I didn't get the gift I wanted. I didn't get the level of affection I wanted. We were fighting with families during this time. It might have been an increase in alcohol use around this time of the year. There's so many things that can trigger these trauma responses is what I'm getting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in the early stage of a relationship, we bond over those. Oh, you grew up in a family like that. Me too. As you were talking, I'm like, oh yeah, I can relate. Like there's parts of, of your story, right? Your narrative. So I think it's like, that's this idea of bonding is like, oh, me too. Oh, me too. Oh, really? Me too. Oh, me too. Because that feels validating. It's like, oh my gosh, you get me. You totally get me. Right. And then fast forward, that comes into this we're constantly triggering and re-triggering each other, right? Around the trauma, or we don't have anything else in common other than the trauma. And then when one person starts to heal and the other person doesn't, that's when fights start, right? Oh, now you're better than me because you're healing.
So now there's like a different equilibrium, because when we met, we were here.
Right.
And I got this filter on, but when we met, we were here. And then one person does the work, and the other one's here. Now it's like there's this feeling of superiority.
Or the perception of superiority.
Perception of,
it's the other person's, moral injury, lack of self-worth, lack of self-love, right? Their own fear. Well, if you get better, you're going to leave me. If you get better, you're going to find somebody who's better than me because I'm not worthy of you.
Do you find that it's adverse though? Because I know, like, just being a trained clinician, I recall my professors pulling me aside and they said, Chris, you really have to be very intentional about your marriage. Now you're in grad school working as a therapist. I said, why? They said, well, therapist trainees actually have one of the highest divorce rates. Yes, because there's this separation and growth. And I asked my professors, I said, so what do I do to prevent that? They said, bring this home to your partner, like conversations in class, not be your partner's therapist, but keep them engaged with your growth and development. And I just recall telling my wife during this process to see me as a shedding reptile. Like there were parts of me that were shedding, and I had to educate her on the new Chris, because it's a rapid growth process when you're in this program.
Yeah.
But my question to you is, do you find that if there's one partner's perception is you're going to leave me, you're elevating, you're getting better, but does the other partner push the partner away by saying, well, I'm going to go back down and try to pull you up with me?
Sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes they'll do that. Sometimes they'll, eventually it'll be like, well, I did the work, you go to therapy. I'm in my own therapy. I'm doing the work. I'm doing all this thing. Will you go? You're not going. So it can create conflict there. Yeah. And sometimes, like you said, people, jump back in the pool to save the other person. And ideally it's finding a common ground where both people can grow as individuals and they can grow the marriage as well, right? Because the marriage is its own unit. Yes. And so I have my own individual growth. My partner has their own individual growth. And we have this third thing, the relationship that we need to grow together.
I
right?
love it. I love it. And that helps couples frame that when they're in the marriage, it's not a competition.
Right.
You're not competing, you're complementing.
Exactly. And it's okay to be in fact, you want to be individuals. You want to be interdependent, not codependent, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the other kind of trauma bonding is when I call it the wounded bird syndrome. And that's just, me being facetious, but it really is when somebody is struggling, they've had something horrific happen, and they start dating somebody who is like, I will save you. It is my goal in life to save you. You are broken. I am not. I love you more than anything, and I will heal you. Right. So that's another kind of trauma bonding. You might have heard it.
And you gave a solution to that earlier. Yeah. And I hear it in my own, like, I'm going to apply this to my own marriage, because men, we naturally at times, I'm not speaking for every man, but a lot of men want to be fixers.
Yes.
And a woman might see that as, you're trying to fix me as if I'm broken. But men, we're just trying to gravitate toward peace. we're really just trying to not have a problem later. That's right. What we're trying to do.
Okay.
But at that point, it now comes off as, you think you're better than me. I'm the one that's broken. No, you got a problem too. But using the I statement in properly communicating the intent, right? Taking ownership. I got ownership, awareness, and validation.
Yeah. And so I've got a trick for that too. So all the guys listening out there who are like, yes, that is my life, right? Here's what you're gonna do is, hey, you know what, honey? I'm not sure. I am not sure what you need. I'm not sure what my role is. Do you want advice? Do you want me to fix it? Or do you just need my support and to listen? What is my role here? Honey, I'm not sure. So you've just got everything.
You have a multiple choice.
Yes. And you're going to take a deep breath and you're going to say, honey, I love you. I'm not sure what my role is here. What do you need from me? Do you want me to listen or do you want advice? I just want you to listen. Okay. Roger that. I can do that. I can listen. Right.
Now, does it go deeper? Because, and this is the therapist talking, right? Like, one of the things I do in session is couples teach each other how to listen. Because listening might, for some couples, is the man, okay, I'm on my phone doing my fantasy draft, but I'm listening, right? And we might think that we just know what listening looks like. So to go even further, do we ask our partner, okay, I want to listen. What does me really listening look like? Sometimes couples want active listening. I want you to listen by being agreeable. I know that the boss yelled at me and I might have been wrong, but I don't want you to call out how I was wrong. I just want you to listen to how they yelled at me. So,
and tell me that they suck, right? I want you to be
a little bit more just listening versus fix. like no. Go further for us.
Yeah, no, totally, right? Like, I don't want you to agree with my boss. I want you to tell me that they suck and they're the worst ever. And, Like I can quit if I want to, even though I'm not going to. It right, I
Right, so
want
we're taking notes. Okay,
time.
note one, listen. Listen means that I need to be just agreeing with you, not the boss. Even though you were late to work, don't mention that part. Let's just focus on how the boss was bad.
Right.
Got it. No, got it. Right.
Otherwise, you're back in therapy.
Right.
I think too, it really comes down to I totally lost my train of thought, Chris. I don't know what the heck I was going to say. No, I think a lot of it is that we don't teach our children how to have effective communication, right? Effective communication and reflective listening. And if you cannot see your partner's eyes, you are not listening.
I like that. So men and women, if you don't see their eyes, you're not listening.
I'm on my phone. I'm like, yeah,
see eyes.
yeah.
And then in therapy, like when couples are like pissed or upset with each other, it's like one's in the corner. Oh, I hear it. No, you don't. Look at her. Look at him. Right.
Or hit like I definitely I'm guilty of that one too, because I'll look down, I'll look, I'm like, I don't want to, like, if I don't see you, I can't hear you. I don't know why we become infants when we fight with our spouses, but we do.
So have you ever there was a book I was reading, and the author talked about that's one of her strategies in therapy. She'll just simply ask the couple or the individual, so what age are you right now?
Yes, that's mine too.
It just hits them. It's like
10.
Oh, yeah, like, what age are you right now? It stops them, and then they realize, like, and they'll give you a number.
Yeah.
7. And then they'll go back to the experience that happened at that age. It's really cool to see that come out.
Right, which is trauma, right? Which is you're like, oh, there's that subconscious trauma. Exactly. That's a technique I use in therapy all the time. It's something that, the listeners can do at home. When you're in the middle of an experience with anyone and you're noticing that you're getting agitated or you're nervous, like you are having some kind of emotional, physical response, ask yourself how old you are right now. Or when you hear that negative talk in your head, right? Whose voice is it? Is it a coach, a teacher, a parent? Is it yours? Who's actually talking to you, right? Because most often it's not our own voice, right? And we are way in the past. We're not in our present self, So this idea of trauma bonding comes from all of the things that we're talking about, and we're giving so many examples of how it shows up every day, right?
It does.
It
Yeah, and I, man, as we come to an end, like, this could be easily a part 2.
absolutely.
Because when we talk about trauma, you've really expanded trauma from the first minute you came on and talked about how trauma is really within the eye of the beholder. It's the experience. It's not this rigid definition based on the big T, little t anymore. And then the subconscious piece is huge. Even getting into how partners can be triggering trauma and not even know. And then we talked about the trauma bonding and how we don't want codependency, but we want interdependency. We want people to have their own narrative, their own self, their own value. And then they come together because you have the 2 partners, then the third person, which is the relationship itself. Right. You also gave amazing skills on I statements, which is huge, especially because women, when they hear you, not all women being, just a blank statement, but typically a woman might hear you as an attack. And then with the can you or will you, can you versus would you with men, because men are like, no, we can do it. Yeah, it doesn't mean we're gonna do it, right? All the strategies, the men listening, if you can't see eyeballs, you're not listening. Yeah. I mean, you really put on a masterclass. You've just educated our audience so much. Like, this is gonna be, I'm sure, just a highlighted show for not just now, but for years later. Even I could see this being something that people go back to as a reference tool. I always like to have our guests lead off or close out, with a final thought. Also, so 2 things. One, how people can contact you, any projects you're working on, any information you want to solicit about you, and how people can continue to gain more information because you have some really good stuff you're putting out. And then in the other pieces, just a final thought or a statement, phrase, or comments that you want to leave to these couples or relationship partners that are in distress.
Yeah, I think the final thought first is that, being able to afford to go to therapy can be a luxury for some people. And that we in our society right now, and I don't want to get on my soapbox, but in our society right now, it is not necessarily affordable for all people. And so keeping your own experience where you're at in the world in mind, making therapy a choice, even if you can find somebody like me who will work with you once a month, once every other week, so that it becomes affordable, or on a sliding scale. There are nonprofits. I'm not a fan of you two can text a therapist companies, but that's another conversation for another day. That's better than nothing. Self-help books, journals, just taking some paper, writing out how you're feeling on a piece of paper, reading, talking to people. So getting online, following Instagram accounts like mine, which every day we put out different skills. And so there's a lot of resources out there for you based on what your income level is at and what you can afford. And so, search that out, talk to people like Chris and I spend more time screening people for whether they're a good fit for my clinic. And if they're not, then we get on Psychology Today and we look for a therapist that's going to work for them. So there are people out there that will help you find somebody that can provide the best support for you. There's great therapists and there are terrible ones. It's like dating. Sometimes you got to see a couple of therapists to find the right person, but don't be afraid to ask your therapist questions. What's your training? Who are you? What do you work with? Have you done this before? Have you had this experience? Have you worked with these kinds of things? And you can interview us, right? We'll good therapists will answer honestly.
Yes, because we don't want to have a negative experience either. We want it to be positive as well. Absolutely.
Right. Because it's a profession that people go into that truly want to help.
Absolutely.
So that's my soapbox. Is there's a lot of stuff out there. You can find me. It's my name. So the website is Joelle Maletis. I know you'll drop the spelling in your show notes.
Yep.
And with all of my handles on IG, but it's the official Joelle Trauma Therapist. You can send me an email. You can whatever, if you need resources. I respond to everything. So don't be shy about reaching out. Connect with us on Instagram and all of our socials. And I will do the shameless plug since you gave me permission. You are the first person. This is the first show I get to do this. The very first one today. The new book is out.
Give yourself
Self-love.
Love it. Yes.
It is a 30-day journal. And so it is all the skills that we've talked about. And so it's on Amazon, but it comes live for everybody on the 14th of November. And I'm so glad, Chris, I got to show it to you first.
I'm so glad too, so I can get a copy of it immediately. Like, this is great. I think about how self-love is so important. And then you've dropped so many amazing skills on this show. So I can only imagine what your book's gonna have. Because you gave so many different helpful tips, and the way you broke them down. It's one thing just to have someone list out a tip or tool, but you do a great job of describing how to use it properly. And I want to thank you for that. And I know all our listeners are going to get so much value from your time here. And I just, once again, I said this, but I mean it. We could easily do a part 2, because trauma is a topic that doesn't get talked about with these levels of detail that you provided today.
Yeah, let's do it, Chris. Hopefully your listeners will send you some comments and what do they want to know about trauma, and maybe we can take some of those questions and dive right into it. I'd love to do it.
I love it. That's the next step, to get the questions from the listeners around trauma.
Yeah.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're extremely busy doing a lot of great work, and I'm humbled and thankful our listeners are as well that you took time to be on our show. For those that have been tuning in, my name is Chris A. Matthews. You've been listening to the Marriage Underdogs Radio Show. Joelle, you have been a blessing. Thank you. I really hope that those that have tuned in will listen to the entire episode, and more importantly, get your book, Give Yourself Self-Love, available on Amazon, right?
It's on Amazon. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm sure it's going to be a top seller very quickly.
Thank you, Chris.
So,
Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
thank you. And thank you all out there that have been listening to us today. The episodes drop every Tuesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. So we look forward to we look forward to providing you more content next Tuesday. Thank you. Thank you as well, Joelle.
Oh, my pleasure.